Hello and welcome again to the True Myth Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Nettesheim, and I am very excited to present my special guest today, Brian Brown. Brian, would you mind saying hi to the nice people?
Hi, nice people, and everyone else.
Brian is the director of the Anselm Society. It's an organization here in Colorado, in Colorado Springs. And Brian, I'd love it if you would just tell our viewers about yourself and about the Anselm Society. And just take it away, man.
Sure. Well, the Anselm Society is a 3-year-old organization whose mission is a renaissance of the Christian imagination. And been privileged to help get that started over the last few years. I sort of backed into it. I have a background in some nonprofit management and organizing, and a love for great music and books and stories and whatnot, and agreed to organize a couple of lectures at my church. And next thing I knew, there was this movement swimming along around me, and artists and pastors coming out of the woodwork to have conversations in the same room that many of them had never had before.
Sure. I mean, just our time with Anselm, there's so many different people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different abilities, and yet all these people are coming together with an awareness and a hunger for what you are trying to do with it.
Seems to be the case, yeah. And I mean, it's been pretty fun being along for the ride, because our first, one of our first events, we had Michael Ward out to talk about the question of is faith without imagination dead?
Mm-hmm.
And we had 250 people there and a wait list, and all of these artists came out that I'd never met before, painters and novelists, and many of those people are now great friends, and I'm getting thrown in the way of fantastic stories and music that I never would have encountered otherwise. And that's been a pretty constant refrain for the people who get involved in the society. The artists are meeting laymen who appreciate their work, or pastors who can perhaps inform it theologically. And then the laymen and the pastors are encountering something that so many of us are hungering for, which is fantastic stories that can move us to tears for all the right reasons.
Sure. I mean, to me, it seems like you're seeking to restore things back to what they should have been all along.
That's certainly the case that I would hope to make, and that I hope to keep trying to make. It's and it's a challenging thing to think about, because I was on actually our own podcast sometime back, and our host Matt Mellema threw me a little bit of a fastball and said flat out, "Hey, have you found that some denominations or traditions have been more receptive to these kinds of ideas than others?" And that's a really important question, but it's a really difficult question, because
Sure.
I think that there are some theological traditions that have hung on to Christian aesthetics better than others.
Mm-hmm.
And that has resulted in a vast difference in the type of songs that are written, the types of stories that are written, whether stories, songs, paintings, stained glass windows, pick your favorite medium, are produced at all. But those that have struggled with it more, that are struggling with it more now, are usually asking the same questions as everybody else. They're just as interested in everybody else. And so they're not so much the villains as the people that have a little bit of a steeper hill to climb.
Sure. Yeah, it seems, and traditions, or at least people who are not as comfortable with mystery and exploration, sometimes it seems to me, anyways, look on art with suspicion. At least when I'm in that place myself, I can be concerned about that. I feel like I have to have this locked down before exploring it through the arts, and that's not always healthy, I think.
Right. I remember I read a blog post a long time ago, long before any of this had come into my life. It was written by a pastor, and I don't remember who it was, but it was a list of ways to drive artists away from your church. And of course, it was tongue in cheek. And one of the things that I remember sticking with me from that piece was that he talked about one of the ways you can drive artists away from your church is by demanding that they know all of the answers, not just the questions.
Oh, that's good.
And right, and there's a sort of a flip side to that lesson for the rest of us. We recently had an event that was it was just storytelling. We had issued a call for stories, short stories that someone could, maybe it was a ballad that someone was singing, but in most cases it was a short story that someone had written and would read aloud to the room,
Mhm.
perform almost in a way of sharing a story that was obviously very common for most of human history and is almost a dead now. And one of the things that we talked about at the beginning of that evening was some habits of how to approach stories that most of us needed to unlearn.
Mhm.
And one of them that is similar to that idea of demanding that the artist know the answer, not just the question, is we so often approach a story. I think we approach stories a lot of the time with not just skepticism, but almost fear. Like we
Mhm.
put our toe into the water in a very tentative sort of way because we want to know if the author's on our team or not,
Right,
or
right.
uh, what's the author's point? Am I going to agree with the point at the end of all this?
Mhm.
And because we're trying to read between the lines so much, we're trying to make sure that we're not going to be um, corrupted or maybe just sort of snuck up on.
Yeah, we're like
And it's
suspicious of emotions, and if you make me feel about characters and then you pull a switcheroo on me and make me empathetic for a position that I don't agree with, then
right.
shame on me, shame on you.
And to some extent, that's a learned habit.
Mhm.
Um, we didn't we weren't born by this. I don't wake up in the morning thinking, gosh, I really hope that I don't get uh, captivated by a great story today. Uh,
Mhm.
but from a Christian standpoint, I think there's a sense that we're sort of used to a lot of the arts being being a threat,
Mm.
um, because it so often is, at the very least, hostile to things that matter to us. So there's some history there, that I don't want to discount too quickly, but it is to a large extent a habit that keeps us from valuing things in great pieces of art that are not Christian at all or not explicitly Christian.
Well, and in an age of, commercialization, we see 30-second stories essentially anytime you turn on the television or drive down the street and see billboards, and they're all trying to toy with your emotions to sell a product, and so maybe
Sure.
we're skeptical in that sense as well. I want to circle back to the Anselm. Go ahead. Where can people connect with the Anselm podcast specifically?
We're on SoundCloud. We're on iTunes. We're working on pushing that to most other major podcast platforms. The easiest way, if you have any trouble, is just to go to anselmsociety.org, and there's a link to the podcast there.
So, a stated goal of the Anselm Society is the renaissance of the Christian imagination, rebirth or born again experience for the Christian imagination. So, what was the state of the Christian imagination as you found it prior to creating Anselm, and what kind of caused you to believe that it needed a rebirth?
I think there's a question of need and there's a question of felt need. I'll start with
Mm,
felt need. We hear a lot from our artists, and not just from our artists, but from the people that we encounter as this thing continues to kind of ripple outward and cross the paths of more people. We hear this phrase, C.S. Lewis, "You too, I thought I was the only one."
mhm,
And he's talking about that as an expression of the emotion that you get when you really encounter a friendship. Oh, you too, I thought I was the only one. Well,
mhm,
the way that a lot of folks that I'm encountering have experienced it is, uh, I thought I was the only one who had difficult questions that I didn't feel comfortable asking.
mm,
Um, or I thought I was, in worst case scenario, I thought I was the only Christian who thought it was not okay to check my brain at the door.
mm, mhm.
Or I thought I was the only Christian who didn't think I was going to hell for reading Harry Potter. So it plays out in a little bit different ways. We meet people who are burned on church, or burned by church rather, because maybe a fundamentalist pastor rubbed them the wrong way at some point, or more commonly, the sense of isolation, either from the church or even within the church, of
Hmm.
this notion of sort of being other
Hmm.
to the mainstream Christianity.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's that felt need, and to some extent, I'm not coming to this from an anti-church perspective, far from it.
Sure.
Um, but I definitely see a lot of people who are either church or very suspicious of church, because whether they can put it in this many words or not, um, they see Christianity as they have experienced it to be something that is um, deeply set against wonder, mystery, complexity in the answer to a question. Um, and then for those who maybe haven't had quite that bad an experience, um, perhaps they go to a church that's very sound on the doctrine, um, by no means discounts, say, emotions, but is approaching the faith in a way that is a little bit one dimensional compared to the way that the rest of life and culture is exerting an influence on them.
Sure.
So you have the world as I experience it. Um, if you're to personify that as
Hmm.
something with an evil scheming mind, the world as I experience it recognizes that I as a person am shaped by at the deepest level by the things I'm trained to love, by the things that I encounter on a daily basis, by the communities, the rhythms, the habits, um, the stories, the songs, all of these tiny little things that create these narratives in my mind and patterns in my life. And in the state of the Christian imagination is one in which the human imagination is being formed second by second, year after year, by this confluence of things. And in the face of that, your typical pastor is told, you're going to see the average member of your congregation. I think it's 2 out of 6 weeks is the average. And in that 2 out of 6 weeks, 2 days out of 6 weeks, you have 45 minutes. Put
Hmm.
words together and fix all of it. Go. That's the
Right.
state of the Christian imagination as we found it.
Yeah, you tell a story in your the talk that you gave at the conference in April about how you were in a service and they were going through the communion time, and there were people behind you talking about previous days' activities, children's soccer events, and so forth, and just how this epic drama that underpins everything, the putting on flesh of our God, coming down, living and dying, and obviously resurrection after that, but just the story of why we take communion was kind of powerless in their imagination, at least in that moment, um, to captivate them. And just that story you told was very powerful in the sense that yeah, you only have a short time if the Christian imagination is relegated to the 45 minutes to an hour that people are within a church service.
Yeah, and it's a challenging thing. I remember in college once I was in a 20th century history class, and I remember every time the professor talked about the beliefs of an individual historical figure, there would be this sort of snicker that rippled across the room. This room full of people was so jaded that they were just deeply, deeply skeptical of the notion that anyone could be sincere in a deep belief. There's always an ulterior motive, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such at the time I remember thinking that it was such a tragic thing, not because they were necessarily wrong in any given instance to be skeptical,
Sure.
but because they could look at an entire century of history and see no heroes. Look at
Hmm.
an entire century of history where some of the most powerfully evil people in human history had sway to destroy millions of lives, and all of the people who set forth to do good, either to battle those macro enemies, or whether it was fighting poverty, or pick your favorite problem. So many people trying to do so many noble things in the face of this, and these people did not have the imaginations to comprehend nobility,
Mm.
even as a hypothetical concept. And
Hmm.
I think that a lot of the church is in a similar boat. We have been so desensitized to wonder by the fact that there's so little to wonder at in
Mm.
this minute to minute existence, um, that we've actually been conditioned out of being able to see and hear God even when He's right before us. Even the people who are very sincere in their faith, very clear about their identity, their loyalties, um, can miss so much, even with um, all of the right boxes, even with going to church regularly, even with knowing the right doctrines, even with having good Christian friends. If you have taken wonder out of the equation, if you've taken the ability to encounter the transcendent in a meaningful way out of the equation, you've essentially created a dynamic where that person is can't be more than 5% Christian in terms of his consciousness. And not because it's that person's fault, but because that's what he's been left with. And that's exactly what happens when you take something as important as a religion and remove most of the stories, remove most of the history, remove the art, remove the architecture, remove all of the things that everything about human history, and for that matter, social science, has taught us humans need in order to make sense of things around them.
Hmm.
All of the things that are designed to channel our natural sense of wonder in the right direction, take them all away. We have people
Mm.
who are deeply Christian and yet handicapped Christians.
You turn on the news at any given point, and you see people doing very terrible things. And in my mind, most of those terrible things are done because there is no imagination for hope. There's no sight that things can be better or can be redeemed, or there's anything beyond the self. I know when I feel, personal despair or anything like that, that seems to be, I've forgotten that hope. My imagination is not active, and so on a level that I find very beautiful. I think what you're seeking to do with Anselm, and what a lot of people are doing across, it seems to be popping up more and more in churches, is recognizing the need for the imagination to be just as vital a part of the Christian experience as anything else.
And the challenge is, the in the 70s and 80s, as the as evangelical Christianity, or the religious right, sort of came into its own politically. That was People sometimes forget that was coming straight out of a time. Uh, it was following a time of withdrawal, cultural withdrawal,
Sure.
and over the course of a generation or two, the this thing that we call evangelicalism, whether it's really as monolithic as that or not, um, basically an entire generation of the church had been removed from this piece of being a Christian. Cultural engagement, not necessarily in a political sense, but just in the sense of being in but not of.
Hmm.
Um, they spent two generations forgetting how to do that,
Yeah.
and so when they did come back, they were able, over the course of several decades, to put together some political successes, but spectacularly lose uh, some cultural battles underlying those political successes.
Sure.
And it's a similar dynamic here. If you take something that is an integral part of in this case, a religion, and remove it for a long period of time, multiple generations, then even if you have this great awakening where everyone's looking around saying, well, gosh, we need this back, there becomes this massive question of where do we start?
Mm-hmm.
And even if we figure out where to start, well, then what?
Mm-hmm.
What's the relationship between the institutional church and the arts? What's the relationship between the pastor and the artist? What's the relationship? What am I supposed to do with that person who has that artistic gift that just seems so spiritually attuned but doesn't plug into a praise band?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's a very different thing if you go back 1,000 years and look at the medieval church, the arts, not even necessarily in the sense of the professional arts, although it's certainly also the case, but in the sense of humans were seen as people who inherently engage the world imaginatively. We are created in the image of a creator God and are by nature creative. So you could go to a celebration at any medieval village and you would find every single person in the village participating in the plays and pageants that the entire village was putting together to celebrate that occasion.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you were sewing costume, being the part of a biblical character or whatever it might be, you had a role in that, and it was just taken as a given. This is what people do, and it's a very different thing when you have become so out of the habit of engaging God with your whole being. You've grown accustomed to encountering Him mostly emotionally or mostly cerebrally,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe some combination of the two, or mostly through books, or mostly through these very, very specific, nicely boxed in sort of contexts. It's very, very difficult to go 0 to 60 rebuilding, especially if you're coming from, back to what I said earlier, a tradition that is not in the habit of looking backward for lessons,
Mm-hmm.
not in the habit of drawing from the historical experience of the church.
Yeah. I lament that when you ask the average person today, what do you think of when you think of Christian art? The average person is going to use words like cheesy or sentimental, things of that nature. And I do think that's unfair in the sense that I'm connected to amazing Christian artists of today who do not fit that mold. The problem is they're not promoted a lot by the Christian subculture. And so I guess what I'm asking is how can we engage the culture better with these meaningful expressions when I think well-meaning people and in some sense talented people really struggle with only being comfortable presenting the dare I say positive and encouraging side, and leaving out the weightier things, the more honest things, the deeper things.
This is a great question for as far as going right into the heart and soul of how Anselm approaches things, because uh, I've mentioned these three different groups repeatedly: pastors, artists, and everybody else. And by artists, I mean vocational artists, not even necessarily people who are making their whole living off of their art, but in the sense that um, that's what they would consider their primary vocational identity to be. That's where they're pouring in most of their creative energy. Everyone's
Mhm.
creative,
Sure.
and can learn to approach whatever they do in a more or less creative way. But there's this category of people who just seem to see the world a little bit differently and lean into it especially heavily with the choices they make. And these three groups each have a role to play in this, and some pretty significant learning or relearning to do in that process. So for pastors, there's a theological component. If their tradition has a strong connection to the Christian theological aesthetics, that's actually a thing, by the way,
Mm.
then they need to be spokespeople for that. tradition. If they're coming from a denomination or maybe non-denominational background where that's not as strong, they need to engage it. They need to learn it because they need to be able to preach it.
Mm.
They need to be able to, pastors need to be able to speak up and say, well, no, there's more to the arts than just putting Jesus frosting on the same music everyone else is listening to, or
Yeah.
trying to make you feel good about who you already are or what you already believe,
Mm.
and be able to actually articulate a theology of beauty, a theology of stories, of visual art, of how does this all fit into everything else. Why is it that our sacred writ is massive? Why is it filled with stories and songs and poetry? Why is it that so comparatively little of it is aphorisms for how to live or even commandments?
Mm.
What do we do with that? So there's the pastor's end of things. The artists, meanwhile, have, as you alluded to, I think a big challenge, because we have this thing that didn't exist until relatively recently, the worship industry. I mean, it makes sense even a term,
Hmm.
but it is. And in order to succeed in the worship industry, you have to create a specific form of art.
Right.
It has to be something that a mom who's doing the laundry and is really stressed out will feel a little bit better about herself when she's done listening to it.
Sure.
And it has to fit a very specific stylistic mold even within that. And if you can do that, if you can write kind of music that kind of way, there's an avenue for you to make a lot of money off of that and reach a larger audience.
Hmm.
If that's not you, you are kind of stuck.
Hmm.
Or it's certainly the impression, and that's the experience that most artists are having. And so artists, I think, for starters, need to be in a place where they are making choices to invest their gifts into their communities, their cities, and especially their church communities. And again, pastors need to be able and willing to dialogue with them on that,
Hmm.
and have a conversation about what does it mean for me to be a part of this church as a person, and what does it mean to be a part of this church as an artist? What does it mean for the rest of the church to love me as a person? What does it mean for them to love me as an artist? So it needs to start there, because someone who never makes it big from an album selling standpoint or a book sales standpoint, but can help to shape a congregation such that they are handing down the faith to the next generation, to their children, stronger than they received it,
Hmm.
has already been a massively successful artist.
Hmm.
Now, that said, you've got this third group, laymen. Well, like I said, we need to learn to love artists as people, love them as artists. One of the most important things that some of our member artists have experienced through the Anselm Society Arts Guild is just being able to be in a room with people who simultaneously are genuinely accepting of you as a person. Never going to get thrown out because you're you, but never satisfied with you as an artist,
Mm. Mm.
such that when you create a piece of work, they will celebrate with you and rejoice with you and praise you for what is praiseworthy, but never stop challenging you. And this is how humans are supposed to treat each other. This is certainly how Christians are supposed to treat each other. Love each
Sure.
other unconditionally and challenge each other to be better.
Yeah.
And this can't happen if all of the artists are at the fringes of society writing with bitterness about it's that line from Oscar Wilde, the only people who criticize society are the ones who can't get into it. um,
Mm.
uh, but if artists are being loved and accepted and challenged as members of communities, they can make a tremendous amount of difference in those communities. And that's, I think, inevitably is going to start to open different doors as people
Yeah.
within those communities who have different kinds of influence start to ask questions about, well, gosh, that that band, more people really ought to hear them. What can we do about that?
Sure. Yeah, it seems like there's this image of, or this view of artists in a church where it's like, oh, Janie can paint really well. Let's get her to design a logo for the barbecue on Saturday. And that's about it. Or, this person can play the guitar really well. You can play in the worship band. And those are fine. But I think that there's this deeper sense when an artist is engaging with God and engaging with the needs of their community, there's almost a pastoral role to the work that they do that is not always appreciated. And what you said just a moment ago, shaping the congregation with the work that they do and the people that engage with their work. And I'm encouraged when I see um, churches and preachers take art seriously, but really engaging with what God might be saying through these artists and how these artists are engaging honestly with scripture and their own spiritual walk and taking it seriously on a preaching or pastoral level or something like that. And that's something I see in your organization as well.
Well, thank you. And I agree. That's it's such an interesting dynamic because that idea of the artist having an almost pastoral role, on the one hand, that's an incredibly dangerous thing to say,
Sure,
because you can have that can go wrong in all kinds of different ways. But
sure.
uh, an example that comes to mind, a church in my city does this really cool thing where when they start a new sermon series, the pastor meets with all artists, and they've got a lot, and talks through the scripture passages, does some little devotionals, talks about where they're going to go with the sermons and the takeaways and whatnot, and then challenges them to do a painting based on something in the sermon series. And then they have this art gallery that's on display for weeks during the sermon series.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool as far
Yeah.
as it goes. However, it's also one very limited way of engaging artists, because essentially what you've done is you've called them in and said, here's the limits on the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the limits on what you can say about the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, within this realm of what I want you to say, pick
Mm-hmm.
something you want to say and say it.
Sure, sure.
Um, so there is, you do miss that sense of listening, and artists do tend to have very unique ways of seeing the world that can be channeled in beautiful, beautiful ways if churches can walk that very, very, very narrow line between, um, on the one hand, as an institution sticking to theological, but as humans and as humans dealing with human artists, um, being willing to grapple with the challenges that people's minds create.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like, and maybe it's just we're out of practice, but it seems like we're more comfortable with being made uncomfortable by a sermon than we are by a work of art.
Hmm. And I think there's a certain assumption of spiritual authority coming with a sermon.
Sure.
I'm made uncomfortable by a sermon. Reaction is, uh, should I be looking at my own heart? And
Hmm.
we don't have that response. Now, in fairness, a piece of art is not coming with spiritual authority, but it is interesting that we don't typically have that response when we're bothered by a piece of art. We're likely to criticize the art for bothering us.
So, in talking about artists and community, there's a sense that like you were saying earlier, that artists are sometimes either pushed or feel like they themselves must step to the kind of fringes of the congregation. Sometimes artists can be more introverted, whether out of necessity or that's just not their natural inclination. But sometimes it seems like artists struggle with the deep community. So, in creating the Anselm Society and creating a place for artists to find community, what ways do you kind of draw them into that when sometimes maybe their inclinations may be to not um, engage?
One of the challenges I think in um, particularly modern Protestantism is that we've created formulas for how to approach church that work for more people than not.
Mm,
And I think these types of particularly introverted artists have perhaps the opportunity to draw attention to the shortcomings of particular that, and draw attention to the people that are getting missed. Um, a common one that more and more people are speaking out about is the way that young or not young single people can feel left out in a church that feels very oriented towards families and children.
sure, absolutely.
Um, and a lot of I'm speaking from my own experience. In college, shortly after college, coming from a non-denominational evangelical background, um, I noticed most church activities were heavily social, heavily large group, not necessarily huge group, but I mean, even 10 people is too large a group to have a substantive conversation,
Mm,
um, of the sort that an introvert prefers. Um, so, large group, which in turn puts extroverts at an advantage, also tends to be oriented toward, or just speaking from my own experience, also tended to be oriented towards a certain type of personality that was very comfortable sharing a certain types of emotions in certain types of ways.
sure.
With the result that people who maybe might be very emotional, um, or feel very deeply, didn't feel comfortable expressing their emotions. There wasn't the right vehicle for it.
Mm,
So I think artists have actually, particularly as they connect more with each other, have the opportunity to draw attention to some of this, some of the people that are getting lost in the shuffle, some of the people that are just some of the people that are drifting away, and frankly, just the need for an approach to church, an approach to life that allows for more in the way of a deep one-on-one conversation, more in the way of we're struggling, we're going to keep talking even though we're past the hour and my lunch break's over. Um, whatever the example might be.
mhm.
We tend to be so fast paced, so busy that we're very comfortable with a very programmatic approach to a lot of system in very carefully in terms of structure, in terms of time. This is the reason soccer's good and baseball is declining, because baseball is driven by what's going on in the game. Soccer's over at a certain time and at the end of a certain time. But I think uh, as churches start to wrestle with the fringes, and a couple of us talked to him, tried to make friends, didn't really click. What do we do now? As we start to wrestle with those types of questions, even on an individual basis, one or two people at a time, um, and start to improve dramatically as communities and as churches that can minister to more people more effectively as they grapple with these questions. And artists are in a position to draw attention to that need.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the metaphor of the body of the Christ, a body of Christ.
Mhm.
When certain parts of the body are given attention at the expense of other parts, the body can suffer, even if the body isn't aware of it at the time. Um, and so I love that idea with what you're saying. Making sure you're being intentional about uh, welcoming people in, these artists in are who may or may not know how to say what they need or might not feel comfortable saying what they need. What would you recommend to somebody who's listening, who's maybe not an artist, but who can understand that there are people within their congregation who are like this and who need that community, but who may not feel comfortable articulating it or might not feel comfortable in the ways that it's currently presented? What would you encourage them to do for the artists in their congregation?
They at least know who a few of them are, because it's easier if it's if you've got a name and a face in mind. Um,
Mhm.
they're not always the easiest people to love,
Mm,
honestly. Honestly, a lot of the time there's a reason they're at the fringe, and it's not just the church's fault. Maybe they have a prickly personality. Maybe they're just really shy and it's tough to draw them out. So I think one important thing is just to keep loving them and keep learning to love them. Try to get
Mhm.
to know them well enough in ways that they are comfortable with, that you can start to get a sense of what's going to um, make their day versus what's going to freak them out.
Sure.
Um, so on a personal level, that requires effort, more sustained attention and energy than most people are certainly happy to give.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of a first hurdle. At an institutional level, maybe you don't know who these people are. You have a feeling there must be some in your church, but you don't know anyone specifically. Um, Creating opportunities to give before you start worrying about getting. So that can look like creating little gatherings, get together resources an imaginative person might appreciate. For us, uh, Lord of the Rings and Narnia were the low hanging fruit. It was pretty easy to hang on a sign and say, "Hey, we're going to have a lecture on C.S. Lewis. Uh, you can come, you can sit in a seat. You don't have to talk to anybody if you don't want to, but there's going to be a really cool person here talking. We have faces." So those sorts of non-threatening um, ways of starting to, I guess, I mean, I've used the image of planting a flag more than once, or hanging out a sign. Just this notion of, hey, if you're this sort of person, here's something we're doing for you that we think you will enjoy, that's not terribly threatening.
Sure. Sure.
We've got this artist retreat coming up, and I saw on a number of different Facebook comment threads, as different friends were sharing about this retreat, that they were excited about it. A number of different people. I am terrified of church. I have not
Mhm.
darkened the door of a church in a decade or more, but I think I could go to something like this.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, my wife and I were privileged to go to Hutchmoot, and on the actual map of the conference, they had marked out a specific room called the Introverts Hideaway or something like that, just like a place for introverts to go if they needed a couple of minutes, if the crowds were a little too much. They were welcome to go there, and that is something I've never ever seen specifically um, thought about by uh, those running Christian conference. Typically, because those who start Christian conferences are not those kind of people, and so my wife and I were so amazed that that the Rabbit Room really was aware of uh, that there were going to be people coming here who, were very uncomfortable with this sort of thing, and the ministry of just that little room spoke volumes to me, and I thought it was amazing.
And that's something that can happen so easily in churches too. We've got men within our ministry uh, where it's very much this two-way relationship where we're able to help them develop resources, or develop resources for them, coach them in various ways. They're in turn able, as institutions and as individuals, to um, minister to their congregation better, to minister to the city around them better, um, and to provide more input and cumulative experience to us. And
Mhm.
this comes up there pretty frequently. I also love that, um, just giving some artists a voice in the corridors of power, so to speak, makes such. And you can see this with the way Hutchmoot has developed. They were full disclosure, they borrowed that introvert room idea from us,
Oh,
um,
really? Oh, cool.
and he referenced back in April, and Andrew was there, and he said, "Yes, I'm totally stealing that." And we said,
Oh,
"Please do."
that's awesome. That's great.
And but full it's easy fair trade, because we had stolen so many great ideas from Hutchmoot and the wonderful things that they've done over the last decade. I'm
Good.
encouraged to see on the number of groups operating in this space, whether it's publications like Image Journal, whether it's different conferences, different organizations, retreat centers like Laity Lodge, the number of different people in this space that are talking, that are sharing ideas. If you want to improve this your church or in your neighborhood or in your city, the resources available to you now are so much more significant than they were even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20, because
Sure.
there are more groups out there. Everyone's willing to share ideas.
So say we, in your aim to serve these Christian artists and to get them engaged and um, working to their full capacity with God and creating this meaningful work. And if those of us who have these artistic desires are really just working full steam, we're going 60 miles an hour or whatever, and really producing stuff. That's all well and good, but if there's not an appreciation within the congregations, within the people that we're seeking to be in community with and seeking to bless, then the work doesn't seem to take hold. And so there's a responsibility on the individual Christian within a congregation to do the hard work of appreciation, or learning how to appreciate this work, learning how to engage meaningfully with the arts beyond just, oh, that song had a great beat, or, oh, that's a pretty picture of a flower, or whatever. So how would you encourage Christians to engage meaningfully with art?
And I think there's a couple levels of thinking about this. When we use the word art, we tend to a lot of the time be thinking of what we might call high art or difficult art. I have a problem with the category of high art, if understood in that way. The idea that a poem is supposed to be something you should have to have a PhD and a ton of experience and work your butt off to decipher. In English class, that was called bad communication. And there was actually a great essay in the New York Times a couple months ago about this by I think it was a literature professor. And so we unfortunately think we have such a huge divide, such a huge disconnect right now between high art and low art, that the low art is just terrible and not worth anyone's time, and the high art is inaccessible. So
Sure.
on one level, I would say, if this is your problem, if you face as someone who wants to appreciate art, you should understand that you did not create this problem. This is not a problem because you are a Philistine. This is not a problem because you are uncreative or unartistic, or, oh, I'm just an engineer or something like that, or, oh, I'm just anything. It's funny, this comes up in a worship music context sometimes, people talking about, oh, well, hymns were great for such and such a time period. Gregorian chant was great for such and such a time period. Well, what we do now with guitars and drums is great for our time period. It's kind of a false dichotomy, because if you go to any of those other time periods, you find they had pop music then too.
Sure.
Music with drums. They had music with some form of stringed instruments along the lines of guitars in many cases. But they had this notion that there was sacred music and there was everything else. And you put your best people on the sacred music. You put your best composers, the people who really wanted to make a difference with their art. They were the ones who were supposed to plumb the depths of their craft and do the best work. But they then had a responsibility with that gift that they had developed to create art that shape anyone. And so you can walk into a medieval cathedral with a 5-year-old. This is the pinnacle of medieval architecture, in some ways still unsurpassed architecture from a design and structure standpoint. You don't need to tell that 5-year-old to whisper. You don't need to tell the 5-year-old that she's on holy ground, because the architect put in his best work to do something that shot for the stars from an artistic quality standpoint, but that could move your soul even though you didn't necessarily understand everything that went into it.
That's beautiful.
I realized I kind of just dodged your question and said it's
No,
on
I
the
think
artists.
that's a great answer. I mean, yeah, absolutely. We've talked about that on past episodes. That kind of separation that seems to come, and how do you make art accessible? And I appreciate that you reject that it shouldn't be accessible to certain people. I think that's fantastic. Um, I
Which is
love
not to say
this.
that
Oh, go
everything
ahead.
that has to be sacred art, but if you start by putting your best people on the good stuff, and with that kind of approach, that inevitably works its way down. So if you were, pick a different time period, you look at the pop music of that time period, the pop music of Chaucer's time was drawing from musical innovations coming out of sacred music. Pop
Sure, sure.
music, it was still pub music, it was still music designed to be sung when mostly drunk with a bunch of people at the end of a really hard day's work, but it was drawing from the best music. And typically, this goes back to your original question about the Christian imagination and the state of it. Our music is drawing from, in some ways, the worst music,
Mhm.
from a technical standpoint, rather than taking the best and then allowing it to work its way down into styles that we might listen to on a radio and in an everyday sort of way. We're starting there. We're writing that music for God, and it doesn't trickle up. It only trickles one way.
Would you accept this metaphor that when George Lucas made Star Wars, it was an innovation of its time. It was storytelling like people hadn't at least seen formed in that way before. Started this genre, or at least brought it to a level of prestige. Uh, Changed all this, and then sci-fi movies following it tried to build on that or copy it or so forth. And then when the prequels were made, they were referencing in many ways the things that were referencing the original Star Wars, and people were very dissatisfied with the prequels. Is that kind of a perhaps too nerdy way to understand what you're saying as far as um, Christian high art, or not high art, but art with beauty and intention, inspiring society? But then when the church comes from behind that, like basically making Christian versions of what society is putting out, is that kind of
Mhm.
similar to what you're talking about there?
Yeah, I'm still processing your analogy, but I think it works.
Maybe it doesn't, but that's it's sometimes for me the best way to understand things is through Star Wars. So, um,
Well, an original trilogy versus prequel comparisons are can take you into all kinds of fun places when it comes to these sorts of things. So even if uh, even if I process it for the next 2 days and decide I don't agree with the analogy, I think it was well attempted.
I would be happy to give you 2 minutes to call back in and explain why I'm absolutely wrong on the end of this. So, but we're just about at the end here. I'm hoping, if you don't mind, you ended your talk at the Anselm event in April, and then this was posted in text form on the Anselm website. Um, you kind of wrap everything up in such a beautiful way. Um, do you have this final paragraph in front of you?
Yes, I do.
If you wouldn't mind, Brian, I'd love for the episode to kind of end on your summation here. If you wouldn't mind, go ahead and reading that.
Sure. I had talked about uh, there's a reference to a left and right side of the car. I had talked about a drive that my wife and I had gone on, where the left side of the car was a Subway and a 7-Eleven, and the right side of the car was this fog-ridden, gorgeous sort of moor that
Hmm.
just cut through all of the minute to minute worries and just made you want to get, I don't know, get lost in a Charlotte Bronte novel or something.
Hmm.
And so yeah, that what that's in reference to. So what I said was, we need a renaissance of the Christian imagination. We need to muster the resources that will open our eyes to see wildness and beauty on the right side of the car, to weep on Good Friday and party with abandon on Easter. And we need to invest in the lives of our artists, present and those with a particular gift for seeing, and challenge them with love and understanding to the highest standards of artistic and spiritual excellence, so that they can shape the view on the other side of the car. Wrapping our lives and the lives of our children in an all-encloaking tapestry of light and darkness, heroes and villains, pain and joy, so that in the midst of the ordinary, we see no such thing as ordinary, so that our deepest souls know who we are and whose we are and what story we are really in.
I can't think of a better way to end this. Thank you, Brian, so much for your time today. I think anybody listening in is going to find so many valuable things here from what you've said. And obviously, I encourage everyone listening to connect with the Anselm Society. Brian, what's the best way for folks to get in touch with what you're doing there?
AnselmSociety.org, ANSELM Society.org.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.